Imagine being so sick that you drink boiling animal pee to feel better. Or having such a bad headache that someone drills a hole in your skull with medieval tools. What if I told you that in medieval times, these weren't just desperate last resorts? They were actual medical treatments prescribed by doctors. And here's the crazy part. Most of these cures were deadlier than whatever disease people were trying to fix. But wait until you hear about the nobleman who paid more than a castle for liquid gold that killed him in minutes. You're about to discover 10 of the most horrifying medical treatments from the medieval ages that make modern medicine look like absolute magic. We're talking about treatments so dangerous, so completely backwards, that they killed more people than they saved. And the worst part? People actually believed these would work. Some of these treatments were so popular that kings and queens literally died from them. By the end of this video, you'll understand why the average person back then lived to maybe 30 years old. Trust me, it wasn't just because of poor hygiene. But there's one treatment on this list that's so shocking, so unbelievable, that it'll change how you think about human desperation forever. Let me paint you a picture of medieval medicine. You wake up with a headache, and instead of taking some aspirin, a doctor tells you the only way to fix it is to let him drill a hole in your skull. You got a cut on your hand, and instead of cleaning it with antiseptic, they rub fresh animal dung all over it. You're feeling weak, so they make you drink liquid gold that costs more than your house and will probably kill you within hours. This wasn't some dark fantasy. This was reality for millions of people living between roughly 500 and 1500 AD. The medieval period was a time when medical knowledge had basically disappeared. The Roman Empire had fallen, taking with it centuries of medical advances. Libraries were destroyed, books were burned, and suddenly, doctors were working with less medical knowledge than people had possessed 1,000 years earlier. But here's what makes this even more terrifying. Medieval doctors weren't stupid people. They genuinely believed they were helping their patients. They had their own theories about how the human body worked, and these theories seemed logical to them at the time. The problem was, almost everything they believed was completely wrong. Think of medieval medicine like this. Imagine if all modern medical knowledge suddenly vanished tomorrow, and the only thing left was a children's book about how the body works. Now imagine doctors trying to perform surgery based on that children's book. That's essentially what medieval medicine was: educated people working with completely wrong information, convinced they were doing the right thing. The medieval understanding of medicine was based on something called the four humors theory. Doctors believed that your body contained four fluids: blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile. When these fluids were balanced, you were healthy. When they were out of balance, you got sick. So every treatment was designed to either add or remove one of these fluids from your body. Sounds reasonable, right? Except none of these fluids actually control your health the way they thought they did. And the methods they used to balance these fluids were often so extreme that they'd kill you faster than any disease ever could. What made it even worse was that medieval Europe was constantly dealing with plagues, famines, and wars. People were desperate for medical help, and they were willing to try anything. When you're dying of the Black Death and someone tells you that drinking ground-up human bones might save your life, you're probably going to try it. The other major problem was that medical knowledge was mostly controlled by the church. Many treatments were based on religious beliefs rather than scientific observation. Doctors thought that illness was often a punishment from God, or that evil spirits were causing the problems. So the treatments focused on driving out these spiritual causes rather than addressing the actual medical issues. And here's the kicker. Because so many people died from diseases anyway, it was hard to tell if the treatments were making things worse. If someone died after drinking boiled animal urine, doctors might assume they just didn't drink enough of it, or that they started treatment too late. The idea that the treatment itself might be harmful was rarely considered. I have to be honest with you. Researching this video was one of the most disturbing things I've ever done. As someone who gets queasy at the sight of blood, reading through hundreds of pages of medieval medical text describing these treatments in graphic detail was genuinely traumatic. But I kept going because I realized something important. These weren't monsters performing these treatments. These were people just like us, trying their best with the knowledge they had. It makes you wonder what medical practices we do today that people 500 years from now will look back on in horror. Let's start with one of the most disgusting treatments on our list. And trust me, that's saying something. Medieval doctors actually prescribed drinking boiled animal urine as a cure for various illnesses. And I'm not talking about just any animals. They had specific preferences that would make your stomach turn. Horse urine was considered particularly powerful. Doctors believed that horses were strong, healthy animals, so their urine must contain some kind of healing energy that could be transferred to sick humans. Cow urine was also popular, especially for treating kidney problems, because doctors figured that if cows could produce so much urine, they must know something about kidney health. But here's where it gets really specific and really gross. Different colors of urine were thought to treat different conditions. Dark yellow urine was prescribed for liver problems, while clear urine was used for kidney issues. Doctors would actually examine the color and smell of animal urine like wine tasters, determining which batch would be best for which patient. The preparation process was elaborate and disgusting. First, they'd collect fresh urine from the animal, preferably in the morning when it was supposedly most potent. The collection itself was a skill. There were professional urine collectors who knew exactly how to get the best specimens from different animals. They'd use special copper vessels because doctors believed copper added to the healing properties. Then they'd boil it in these same copper pots, sometimes for hours, until it became this thick, concentrated syrup. The smell alone must have been absolutely horrific. Medieval texts describe the preparation area as smelling like the devil's own kitchen and recommend doing it far from living areas because the stench could make healthy people sick. Patients were told to drink this concoction while it was still warm, usually first thing in the morning on an empty stomach. The theory was that the healing essence would be absorbed more quickly if there was no food to interfere with the process. They believed you needed to drink it fast before the healing properties could escape. But here's what actually happened when people drank boiled animal urine. First, urine is basically liquid waste. It contains all the toxins and chemicals that the animal's body is trying to get rid of. When you concentrate it by boiling, you're making those toxins even more dangerous. It's like taking poison and making it stronger. Second, animal urine contains bacteria and parasites that can cause serious infections in humans. When you boil urine, you don't actually sterilize it properly, you just make it more concentrated. The bacteria become more potent, not less dangerous. The most common side effects were severe stomach cramps, vomiting, and diarrhea. Patients would often become dehydrated from losing so much fluid, which made their original illness even worse. In some cases, the toxins in the concentrated urine would cause kidney damage or liver failure. But here's an unexpected story that shows just how convinced people were that this worked. There was a famous case in 13th century England involving a wealthy merchant named Thomas de Ashby. He had developed severe stomach problems and was told by multiple doctors that only horse urine could save him. De Ashby was so convinced this treatment would work that he actually bought his own horse specifically for its urine. He paid someone to collect fresh urine from this horse every morning, had it prepared according to the most expensive method available. He drank concentrated horse urine every day for 3 months. Not only did his stomach problems get worse, but he developed additional symptoms including severe kidney pain and blood in his own urine. When he finally died, his family was convinced it was because he hadn't started the treatment soon enough. They actually continued the practice, giving horse urine to other sick family members for generations. There are documented cases of people dying within days of starting this treatment. One medieval chronicle describes a nobleman who was given horse urine to treat his fever. Instead of getting better, he developed violent stomach pains and died after 3 days of agony. His last words were reportedly asking for more urine because he thought he just needed a stronger dose. But the doctors didn't blame the treatment. They assumed the patient hadn't drunk enough urine or that they'd used urine from an unhealthy horse. So they prescribed even larger doses for the next patient, making the treatment even more dangerous. The belief in urine therapy was so strong that it continued for centuries. Even as late as the 1600s, there were medical textbooks recommending animal urine for everything from headaches to infertility. Some doctors developed elaborate theories about which animals produced the most healing urine, leading to a thriving trade in exotic animal waste. The most expensive urine came from young, healthy bulls that had been fed special diets. This premium urine could cost more than most people earned in a month, but desperate families would pay anything for a chance to save their loved ones. But wait until you hear what they did with dead animals, because drinking boiled pee was just the beginning of their animal-based medicine. Number 2. Using dead mice as medicine. If drinking boiled animal urine sounds bad, wait until you hear about the medieval practice of using dead mice as medicine. This wasn't some rare folk remedy practiced in remote villages. This was mainstream medical treatment recommended by trained doctors and written about in official medical texts. The most common use for dead mice was treating toothaches. Medieval people had terrible dental hygiene, so toothaches were incredibly common and extremely painful. When someone came to a doctor with tooth pain, the standard treatment was to take a recently killed mouse, cut it in half, and press the warm, bloody mouse flesh directly against the painful tooth. But here's the part that really shows how detailed their belief system was. The mouse had to be killed in a specific way. It couldn't just be any dead mouse you found. It had to be a healthy mouse that was killed by breaking its neck with your bare hands. The theory was that the mouse's life force had to be transferred directly to the patient, and using poison or traps would contaminate this life force. The theory behind this treatment was based on a medieval belief in sympathetic magic. Doctors thought that mice had very strong teeth because they could chew through almost anything. By applying mouse flesh to a human tooth, they believed some of that strength would transfer over and heal the damaged tooth. But it gets worse. For more serious dental problems, like infected gums or abscessed teeth, doctors would recommend keeping the dead mouse in your mouth for hours at a time. Patients were told to bite down on the mouse carcass and let the blood and fluids mix with their saliva. The idea was that the longer you kept the mouse in your mouth, the more healing power you would absorb. Some doctors even had specific instructions about which part of the mouse to use for different problems. The head was considered best for headaches, the body for stomach problems, and the tail for problems with extremities like fingers and toes. Dead mice were also used to treat other conditions in ways that would make your skin crawl. Foreskin infections. Doctors would cut open a fresh mouse corpse and rub the warm internal organs directly onto the infected area. They believed that the heat from the mouse's recently living organs would draw out the infection. For burns, they'd make a paste from ground-up mouse bones mixed with mouse blood and spread it over the burned skin. The theory was that mouse bones were very strong because mice could survive falls that would kill larger animals, so this strength would help human bones and skin heal faster. One of the most horrifying uses was for treating children's diseases. When babies had colic or fever, doctors would sometimes prescribe feeding them a broth made from boiled mice. The parents would cook several mice in water for hours, strain out the solid pieces, and then spoon-feed the resulting liquid to their sick children. Here's an unexpected story that shows just how widespread this practice was. In 1347, during the early days of the Black Death, there was a monastery in northern France where the monks were dying at an alarming rate. The surviving monks became convinced that they needed to try more extreme treatments to save themselves. The monastery's infirmarian, Brother Augustine, decided that regular mouse treatments weren't strong enough for such a serious plague. So he developed what he called the Great Mouse Cure, a treatment that involved consuming an entire mouse every day for a week. The monks would fast until they were extremely hungry, then eat a whole roasted mouse, believing that their hunger would help them absorb more of the mouse's life force. Brother Augustine documented this treatment in detail, describing how the monks would pray over each mouse before eating it. Not only did this treatment fail to protect them from the plague, but it actually made them sicker faster. The monks who tried the Great Mouse Cure developed severe stomach problems and died more quickly than those who didn't try it. But Brother Augustine, even as he was dying, wrote that he believed the treatment had been successful. He thought it had prevented them from suffering as much during their final illness. The reality is that dead mice are absolutely crawling with bacteria, viruses, and parasites. When you put raw mouse flesh in your mouth or rub it on open wounds, you're introducing all of these pathogens directly into your body. Instead of curing infections, this treatment almost always made them much worse. Mouse-borne diseases include salmonella, rat bite fever, and various types of bacterial infections that can cause blood poisoning. In medieval times, when antibiotics didn't exist, even minor infections could become life-threatening very quickly. There are records of people developing severe jaw infections after using dead mice to treat toothaches. The infection would spread from the tooth to the surrounding tissue, causing massive swelling and pain. In some cases, the infection would spread to the bloodstream, causing sepsis and death. Children were especially vulnerable to this treatment. Their immune systems weren't strong enough to fight off the bacterial infections caused by consuming mouse broth. Many babies who were given this treatment died not from their original illness, but from the massive infections caused by the supposed cure. But again, medieval doctors didn't make the connection between the treatment and these complications. They assumed that the patients had waited too long to start treatment, or that they hadn't used fresh enough mice. Some doctors even recommended using larger mice, or mice that had been killed in specific ways, thinking that would make the treatment more effective. The practice became so refined that there were specialists who sold different types of mice for different medical purposes. White mice were considered more powerful than brown ones. Young mice were preferred over old ones. Some sellers even claimed to have mice that had been fed special diets to make them more medicinally potent. But if you think dead mice were bad, wait until you hear about the medieval obsession with removing blood from sick people and how they turned this into an art form that killed more patients than it saved. Number 3. Bloodletting with leeches. Now let's talk about one of the most popular and deadly medical treatments in medieval history, bloodletting with leeches. This practice was so widespread that virtually every doctor in Europe used it, and it probably killed more people than any other single medical treatment in human history. The basic idea behind bloodletting was that most illnesses were caused by having too much blood in your body, or by having bad blood that needed to be removed. Medieval doctors believed that by taking out some of your blood, they could restore the natural balance of your body's fluids and cure whatever was wrong with you. Think of medieval doctors like mechanics who think every car problem can be fixed by draining the oil. Engine making noise? Drain some oil. Car won't start. Must be too much oil. Brakes not working. Definitely an oil problem. That's essentially how they thought about blood in every medical condition. Leeches were considered the most sophisticated method of bloodletting because they were supposedly more precise than other techniques. These weren't just any leeches. Medieval doctors used special medical leeches that could be up to 6 inches long and as thick as your thumb. A single leech could suck out about 1 ounce of blood, so doctors would often apply dozens of leeches to a single patient. But here's what made this treatment particularly horrifying. Doctors had elaborate theories about where to place the leeches on the body for different conditions. For headaches, they put leeches on the temples and behind the ears. For stomach problems, leeches went on the abdomen. For madness, they'd cover the patient's entire head with leeches. The process was absolutely horrifying. First, the doctor would make small cuts in the patient's skin to encourage bleeding. Then they place the leeches on these cuts and wait for them to attach. Once a leech latched on, it would suck blood for anywhere from 30 minutes to several hours, slowly swelling up like a disgusting blood balloon. The most disturbing part was that patients were often conscious throughout this entire process, watching these creatures literally suck the life out of them. Medieval texts describe patients begging for the treatment to stop, but doctors would insist that they needed to let the leeches finish their work. Here's an unexpected story that shows just how extreme this practice became. In 1685, when King Charles II of England had a stroke, his doctors applied what they called the royal treatment, the most aggressive bloodletting protocol they could devise. They didn't just use leeches. Over the course of 4 days, they removed blood using leeches, cutting veins, cupping using heated cups to draw out blood, and several other methods. In total, they removed about 58 ounces of blood. That's nearly half of all the blood in his body. The king's condition got worse with each treatment, but the doctors were convinced this meant they needed to remove even more blood. They thought the stroke was caused by excess blood pressing on the brain, so the logical solution was to keep draining blood until the pressure was relieved. Charles II died on the 4th day of treatment. Modern doctors who have analyzed the historical records believe he probably would have survived the stroke if they had just left him alone. Instead, the bloodletting treatments essentially drained him to death while he was trying to recover from a relatively minor medical event. But here's where it gets really dangerous. Medieval doctors didn't understand how much blood a human body actually needs to function. They thought that removing large amounts of blood would help almost any condition, so they'd often take out dangerous amounts. A typical bloodletting session might remove 1 to 2 pints of blood. That's roughly 10 to 20% of the blood in an adult's body. For comparison, modern blood donors only give 1 pint, and they're carefully monitored to make sure they're healthy enough to handle it, and they're given food and drinks to help them recover. Medieval patients weren't so lucky. Doctors would prescribe bloodletting for pregnant women, elderly people, children, and patients who were already weak from illness. These people couldn't afford to lose large amounts of blood, but the doctors didn't realize that. The immediate effects of excessive bloodletting were weakness, dizziness, and fainting. Patients would often collapse during or immediately after the treatment. But doctors interpreted this as a sign that the treatment was working. They thought the patient was getting rid of the bad humors that were making them sick. The longer-term effects were even worse. Patients who survived the initial bloodletting were left severely anemic. Their bodies couldn't carry enough oxygen to their organs, making them vulnerable to heart problems, brain damage, and death from seemingly minor illnesses. The irony is that bloodletting often made the exact symptoms it was supposed to cure much worse. If someone had a fever from an infection, the bloodletting would weaken their immune system and make the infection more dangerous. If someone was already weak from illness, removing blood would make them even weaker. But perhaps the most tragic cases involved treating infectious diseases with bloodletting. When someone had a fever from an infection, medieval doctors would assume they had too much blood and would immediately start removing it. But fever patients need all their blood to fight off the infection. By weakening them with bloodletting, doctors were basically guaranteeing that the infection would kill them. During plague outbreaks, bloodletting was one of the most common treatments. Patients who might have survived the disease on their own were killed by the massive blood loss from the supposed cure. Some medical historians estimate that bloodletting killed more plague victims than the plague itself. The practice was so ingrained in medical thinking that it continued well into the 19th century. George Washington, the first president of the United States, died in 1799 after doctors removed about 40% of his blood in a single day while treating a throat infection. He probably would have recovered completely if they'd just given him some tea and let him rest. But the leeches were just one way medieval doctors tried to balance the body's humors. Wait until you hear what they did with human bones and why people paid fortunes for the privilege of eating powdered corpses. Number 4. Powdered human bones. Here's where medieval medicine gets really dark. Doctors actually prescribed powdered human bones as medicine. This wasn't some underground black market remedy. This was official medical treatment that you could buy from licensed apothecaries in major cities. There were literally shops with signs advertising fresh human bone powder, finest quality. The most common use for powdered human bones was treating epilepsy. Medieval doctors believed that seizures were caused by weakness in the patient's bones, so they figured that consuming the bones of healthy humans would strengthen the patient's skeleton and stop the seizures. But not just any human bones would work. The bones had to come from people who had died young and healthy, preferably in violent deaths. The theory was that people who died suddenly retained more life force in their bones than people who died slowly from illness. This created a horrifying trade in human remains. Executioners would sell the bones of criminals who had been hanged or beheaded. Battlefield scavengers would collect bones from soldiers who had died in combat. Some unscrupulous dealers even grave-robbed fresh corpses to get the highest quality bones. Here's the part that shows how organized this trade became. There were actually quality grades for human bone powder. Premium grade came from young knights who died in battle. Standard grade came from executed criminals who were healthy when they died. Economy grade came from people who died of natural causes, and it was considered much less effective. The most expensive bone powder came from executed virgin women, because medieval doctors believed that virginity somehow concentrated the life force in the bones. This powder could cost more than most people earn in a year, but desperate families would mortgage their homes to buy it. The preparation process was elaborate and disgusting. First, the bones had to be cleaned of all flesh and tissue, usually by boiling them or leaving them out for animals to pick clean. Then they were dried in ovens and ground into a fine powder, using mortar and pestle. But here's an unexpected story that shows just how far this practice went. In 1348, during the Black Death, there was a wealthy Italian merchant named Giovanni da Cremona who became convinced that bone powder was the key to surviving the plague. Giovanni didn't just buy bone powder. He hired grave robbers to bring him fresh corpses of plague victims who had died quickly, believing that people who died fast from the plague must have had very strong bones to resist the disease for so long. He set up his own bone processing operation in his mansion's basement. He employed people to clean the bones, others to dry them, and specialists to grind them into the finest possible powder. He was essentially running a human bone powder factory. Giovanni consumed massive amounts of this powder every day, mixing it with wine and honey. He also gave it to his entire household, his wife, children, servants, and even his animals, because he believed it would protect everyone from the plague. Not only did this not protect him from the plague, but the bone powder made him and his family much sicker, much faster. The contaminated bone powder was full of plague bacteria, and by consuming it regularly, they were essentially giving themselves concentrated doses of the disease they were trying to avoid. Giovanni's entire family died within 2 weeks, probably from a combination of the plague and severe poisoning from the contaminated bone powder. But the story doesn't end there. When local authorities found his bone processing operation, they were so horrified that they burned down his entire mansion and banned the sale of bone powder in the city. The resulting powder was mixed with wine, honey, or other liquids to make it easier to swallow. Patients were typically given 1 to 2 teaspoons per day, often for weeks or months at a time. Some doctors prescribed larger doses for more serious conditions, not realizing they were essentially poisoning their patients. But consuming human bone powder caused serious health problems. First, bones that weren't properly cleaned often contained rotting flesh and bacteria, leading to severe stomach infections. Second, the grinding process often introduced dirt, metal fragments, and other contaminants into the powder. More importantly, there's absolutely no medical benefit to eating human bones. Bones are mostly calcium and phosphorus, which you can get much more safely from milk and vegetables. The idea that consuming someone else's bones would cure epilepsy or any other condition is complete nonsense. In reality, patients who took bone powder often experienced severe digestive problems. The coarse powder would irritate their stomachs and intestines, causing pain, bleeding, and sometimes dangerous blockages. The bacterial contamination from improperly prepared bones caused dysentery and other intestinal infections. But the most tragic aspect of this treatment was that it was often given to children. Parents would spend huge amounts of money buying bone powder to treat their epileptic children, not realizing that they were making their kids sicker. Medieval epilepsy treatments using bone powder were particularly cruel because seizures would sometimes stop temporarily for unrelated reasons, leading families to believe the treatment was working. They'd continue giving their children the dangerous powder, often for years, causing long-term digestive damage and malnutrition. The practice was so lucrative that there were entire businesses built around it. Some apothecaries specialized in human bone preparations and claimed to have secret methods for making their powders more potent. They'd advertise bones from specific types of people, young warriors, virgin maidens, or executed criminals as being more effective for different conditions. This trade continued for centuries because it was incredibly profitable and because desperate people were willing to pay almost anything for a cure. It wasn't until the development of modern chemistry in the 18th century that scientists were finally able to prove that consuming human bones has no medical benefits whatsoever. But if you think eating powdered human bones was bad, wait until you hear what medieval doctors thought was a good idea to put on open wounds and why they believed animal waste was nature's perfect medicine. Number 5. Rubbing dung on wounds. One of the most counterproductive medical treatments in medieval times was using animal dung to treat wounds and injuries. This practice was so common that virtually every household knew the correct way to apply manure to cuts, burns, and infected sores. There were actually detailed instruction manuals on the proper technique for wound dung application. Medieval doctors believed that fresh animal dung contained healing properties. They thought that because animals seemed to recover quickly from injuries, their waste must contain some kind of natural medicine that could help humans heal as well. But here's where their logic got really specific. Different types of dung were believed to have different healing properties based on what the animal ate and how it lived. Cow dung was considered best for treating burns because cows were seen as gentle, peaceful animals that ate only grass. Horse dung was preferred for deep cuts because horses were strong and resilient. Pig dung was sometimes used for infected wounds because pigs were thought to have natural resistance to disease. The most expensive and supposedly most effective dung came from animals that had been fed special diets. There were actually dung dealers who would sell manure from cows that had been fed only on specific herbs, or from horses that had eaten nothing but the finest oats. This premium dung could cost more than most people's monthly food budget. The application process was exactly as disgusting as it sounds. Doctors would take fresh, warm animal droppings and spread them directly onto open wounds. Sometimes they'd mix the dung with other substances like honey or wine to make it stick better. Patients were told to keep the dung on their wounds for days at a time, replacing it with fresh manure as needed. For burns, the treatment was even worse. Doctors would pack the burned area completely with cow dung, sometimes covering the entire injury with a thick layer several inches deep. They believed this would draw the heat out of the burn and prevent scarring. The patient would be wrapped in bandages with this dung pack underneath, creating a hot, moist environment that was perfect for breeding dangerous bacteria. Here's an unexpected story that shows just how convinced people were that this treatment worked. In 1203, during the siege of Chateau Gallard in France, there was a young knight named Sir Robert de Montfort who was badly burned when enemy soldiers threw burning oil over the castle walls. The castle surgeon immediately treated Robert's burns with what he considered the finest medicine available: fresh cow dung from the castle's prized dairy cows, mixed with honey and blessed wine. They packed his burns completely with this mixture and changed the dressing daily with fresh dung. Sir Robert's family was so confident in this treatment that they documented it in detail, planning to use his recovery as proof of the treatment's effectiveness. They kept careful records of which cow the dung came from, what the cow had eaten, and even what prayers were said over the mixture. Instead of healing, Robert's burns became horribly infected. The dung treatment turned what might have been recoverable burns into gangrenous wounds that spread across his entire torso. He died in agony after 2 weeks of this treatment, with his family still convinced that the dung medicine was helping him. But here's the most tragic part. Right before he died, Robert begged them to stop putting dung on his wounds because the pain was unbearable. His family refused, thinking that his suffering meant the medicine was working to drive out the evil humors that had caused his burns. But here's the reality. Animal dung is absolutely loaded with harmful bacteria. When you put fresh manure on an open wound, you're introducing thousands of different pathogens directly into the injury. Instead of helping wounds heal, this treatment almost guaranteed that they would become severely infected. The most common result was massive bacterial infections that would spread throughout the wound and into the surrounding tissue. These infections would cause incredible pain, swelling, and pus formation. Many patients developed gangrene, where the infected tissue would literally die and turn black. Tetanus was another common complication. The bacteria that caused tetanus live in soil and animal waste, so putting fresh dung on wounds was basically a guaranteed way to get this deadly disease. Tetanus causes muscle spasms so severe that they can break bones, and in medieval times it was almost always fatal. There are numerous documented cases of people dying from infections caused by dung treatments. One medieval chronicle describes a farmer who cut his hand while harvesting grain. Following standard medical advice, he packed the wound with fresh cow dung. Within days, his entire arm was swollen and infected. The infection spread to his bloodstream, and he died within a week. Children were especially vulnerable to this treatment. Their immune systems couldn't fight off the massive bacterial infections caused by applying animal waste to their wounds. Many children who might have survived minor injuries died from the infections caused by the dung treatments. But the most tragic cases involved burn victims. When someone suffered severe burns, applying cow dung would trap bacteria and heat against the burned skin, making the injury much worse. Instead of healing, the burns would become infected and often develop into life-threatening systemic infections. Medieval doctors didn't understand the connection between dung treatments and these complications. When patients developed infections after having manure applied to their wounds, doctors would often blame the patient for not keeping the dung fresh enough or for removing it too soon. Some doctors even recommended using dung from specific animals or prepared in special ways. They thought that dung from animals fed certain diets or manure that had been blessed by priests would be more effective. This led to an elaborate system of dung preparation that made the treatment even more expensive and time-consuming, but no less dangerous. The practice was so ingrained in medieval medicine that it continued for centuries. Even educated people and wealthy families used dung treatments because they were considered standard medical care. It wasn't until the development of germ theory in the 19th century that doctors finally realized that putting animal waste on wounds was one of the worst possible things they could do. But if smearing animal waste on wounds seems extreme, wait until you hear about the ultimate medieval status symbol cure, a treatment so expensive that only kings could afford it, and so deadly that it killed them faster than any disease ever could. Number 6. Drinking molten gold. Perhaps the most expensive and deadly medieval medical treatment was drinking molten gold. This practice was mostly limited to the wealthy elite, including kings, nobles, and rich merchants, because gold was incredibly expensive and the treatment required significant amounts of the precious metal. But here's the thing that really shows how insane this was. People literally paid more for this treatment than it would cost to build a castle, just to die in the most agonizing way possible. Medieval doctors believed that gold was the most perfect metal in nature. It didn't rust, it didn't decay, and it seemed to last forever. They reasoned that if humans could somehow absorb the properties of gold into their bodies, they could achieve similar immortality and perfect health. The theory was that drinking liquid gold would purify the blood, strengthen the bones, and extend life indefinitely. Some doctors claimed that regular gold consumption could make a person live for hundreds of years, immune to disease and aging. They called it the elixir of eternal life and wrote elaborate treatises on its supposed benefits. But here's how specific their beliefs got. Different preparations of gold were thought to have different effects. Gold dissolved in acid was supposed to cure internal diseases. Gold melted with silver was believed to enhance beauty and youth. Pure molten gold was considered the most powerful treatment, capable of granting actual immortality. The preparation process was incredibly dangerous and expensive. First, pure gold had to be heated to over 1,900 degrees Fahrenheit until it became liquid. This required special furnaces and expert metalworkers who knew how to handle molten metal safely. The liquid gold was then supposed to be consumed while it was still hot, often mixed with wine or honey to make it more palatable. But here's an unexpected story that shows just how far the wealthy would go for this treatment. In 1410, there was a German prince named Heinrich von Braunschweig who became obsessed with achieving immortality through gold consumption. Heinrich didn't just want to try gold medicine, he wanted to perfect it. He hired the most famous alchemists in Europe and built a special laboratory in his castle dedicated entirely to gold preparation. He spent more on this laboratory than most kingdoms spent on their entire armies. The alchemists developed increasingly elaborate gold preparations for Heinrich. They created gold dissolved in various acids, gold mixed with precious gems, and gold that had been heated and cooled according to astrological charts. Heinrich tried dozens of different gold preparations over several years. But the regular gold treatments weren't giving Heinrich the immortality he wanted, so he decided to try the ultimate cure, drinking pure molten gold. On his 40th birthday, convinced that this would grant him eternal youth, Heinrich consumed nearly a full cup of liquid gold heated to almost 2,000 degrees. He died instantly. The molten gold burned through his mouth, throat, and stomach so quickly that witnesses said you could actually see steam rising from his body. His last words were reportedly, "I feel the immortality beginning," before he collapsed and died in less than a minute. But here's the really insane part. His death didn't discourage other wealthy people from trying gold treatments. Instead, they assumed he had used the wrong temperature or preparation method. Some alchemists claimed his death proved that the treatment was working. They said he had achieved a form of spiritual immortality even though his body had died. Of course, drinking molten gold is basically guaranteed suicide. Liquid gold at nearly 2,000 degrees would instantly destroy the mouth, throat, and digestive system. Even if the gold cooled slightly before consumption, it would still cause massive internal burns and almost certain death. But medieval doctors had elaborate theories about why this treatment was safe. They believed that gold was so pure and perfect that it couldn't harm the human body. They thought that the heat of the molten gold would burn away impurities in the patient's blood, leaving only healthy tissue behind. The reality was that anyone who actually drank molten gold died almost immediately. The superheated metal would cause instant and fatal burns throughout the digestive system. Even small amounts would be lethal, causing death within minutes or hours. There are documented cases of wealthy people dying from gold treatments. Pope Innocent IV supposedly died in 1254 after drinking a gold-based medicine, though some historians debate whether it was actually molten gold or just a medicine containing gold particles. More certain is the case of Diane de Poitiers, the mistress of King Henry II of France. She regularly consumed a medicine containing liquid gold, believing it would preserve her beauty and extend her life. Modern analysis of her preserved hair shows extremely high levels of gold toxicity, and many historians believe this treatment contributed to her death. But most of the time, the molten gold treatments weren't actually molten gold at all. The doctors and alchemists who prepared these medicines knew that real liquid gold would kill their patients instantly, so they developed elaborate alternatives. Some practitioners would dissolve tiny amounts of gold leaf in strong acids, creating a liquid that contained gold but wasn't actually molten metal. Others would create fake gold solutions using yellow dyes and other chemicals that looked like liquid gold but were slightly less deadly. Even these alternative gold treatments were extremely dangerous. The acids used to dissolve gold leaf could cause severe chemical burns in the mouth and throat. The fake gold solutions often contained mercury, lead, and other toxic metals that would cause heavy metal poisoning. Patients who survived the initial gold treatment often suffered from long-term heavy metal poisoning. They would experience symptoms like hair loss, tooth loss, neurological problems, and organ failure. Many died weeks or months later from the accumulated effects of metal toxicity. The expense of gold treatments meant that only the very wealthy could afford them, but it also meant that there was huge pressure on doctors to make the treatments work. When a king or nobleman paid a fortune for a gold cure and then died anyway, the doctor's reputation and often their life would be at stake. This led to increasingly elaborate and expensive gold preparations. Some alchemists claimed to have developed special methods for preparing gold that made it safer to consume. They would charge enormous fees for these improved gold treatments, which were usually just as deadly as the original versions. The belief in gold as medicine was so strong that it persisted well into the Renaissance period. Even as other medieval medical practices were being abandoned, wealthy people continued to pay huge sums for gold treatments and continued to die from them in large numbers. But if drinking liquid metal seems extreme, wait until you hear what they thought ground-up snails could do for your health and why eating slugs was considered a medical breakthrough. Number 7. Eating ground-up snails. Medieval doctors had a particular fondness for prescribing ground-up snails as medicine, especially for treating coughs, colds, and respiratory problems. This treatment was considered relatively safe and affordable compared to some of the more extreme remedies, but it was still incredibly dangerous and often made patients much sicker. The theory behind snail medicine was based on the medieval understanding of moisture and dryness in the body. Doctors believed that coughs and respiratory problems were caused by having too much dry humor in the lungs and throat. Since snails were obviously very moist creatures, they reasoned that consuming snail flesh would add moisture to the patient's respiratory system and cure the dryness. But here's where their logic got really detailed. Different types of snails were believed to have different medicinal properties. Garden snails were considered good for general coughs. Large vineyard snails were preferred for treating asthma because they live high off the ground, closer to pure air. Water snails were used for lung infections because they lived in water, which was thought to make their moisture more potent. The most expensive snails were ones that had been fed specific diets. Some doctors claimed that snails fed only on medicinal herbs would absorb the healing properties of those plants and become more powerful medicine. There were actually snail farms where people would raise snails specifically for medical use, feeding them expensive herbs and charging premium prices for the resulting medicinal snails. Garden snails were the most commonly used variety, though some doctors preferred larger species that could provide more medicine per snail. The preparation process involved collecting dozens or sometimes hundreds of live snails, then crushing them into a paste using mortar and pestle. The resulting snail paste was often mixed with honey, wine, or other liquids to make it easier to swallow. Some doctors would dry the snail paste and grind it into a powder that could be mixed with water or broth. Patients were typically told to consume several spoonfuls of snail preparation per day, often for weeks at a time. For more severe respiratory problems, doctors sometimes prescribed live snails. Patients would be told to swallow whole snails alive, believing that the living creatures would provide more healing power than dead ones. Some treatments involve holding live snails in the mouth for extended periods, letting their slime coat the throat and mouth. Here's an unexpected story that shows just how seriously people took snail medicine. In 1289, there was a famous Italian physician named Master Giovanni, who claimed to have discovered the perfect snail treatment for consumption, what we now call tuberculosis. Master Giovanni's treatment involved collecting exactly 100 garden snails during the full moon, feeding them nothing but holy water and blessed bread for 7 days, then grinding them into a paste while reciting specific prayers. The resulting mixture was supposed to be so powerful that it could cure even the most advanced cases of consumption. Word of this miracle cure spread across Europe, and desperate families would travel hundreds of miles to get Master Giovanni's snail treatment. He charged enormous fees and claimed a perfect success rate, saying that anyone who wasn't cured simply hadn't followed his instructions exactly. But here's what actually happened to his patients. A wealthy merchant named Carlo di Venezia traveled from Venice to try Master Giovanni's snail cure for his dying daughter. Carlo paid the equivalent of a small fortune and followed every instruction perfectly. His daughter dutifully consumed the snail paste for weeks, but instead of getting better, she developed severe stomach problems and began vomiting constantly. When Carlo complained to Master Giovanni, he was told that this was proof the treatment was working. The snails were driving the consumption out of her body through vomiting. The girl died within a month, but not from consumption. Modern analysis of the case suggests she died from severe malnutrition and dehydration caused by constant vomiting from eating contaminated snail paste. But Master Giovanni claimed this as another success, saying he had successfully cured her consumption. She just happened to die from unrelated causes afterward. But eating ground-up snails created serious health problems. First, snails are common carriers of parasites, especially lungworms and other intestinal worms that can infect humans. When you eat raw or undercooked snail meat, you're very likely to pick up these parasites. Lungworm infections were particularly dangerous because the parasites would migrate to the patient's lungs and brain, causing severe neurological symptoms. Patients would experience headaches, seizures, and sometimes permanent brain damage or death. Snails also carry various bacteria and viruses that can cause severe gastrointestinal illness. The slimy mucus that covers snails is full of harmful microorganisms that would cause violent stomach cramps, vomiting, and diarrhea when consumed. Even worse, many of the snails used in medieval medicine had been feeding on toxic plants or contaminated soil. When patients ate these snails, they would also consume concentrated amounts of whatever toxins the snails had been eating, leading to poisoning symptoms on top of the parasitic infections. There are documented cases of people dying from snail treatments. One medieval chronicle describes a monk who was given ground snail paste to treat a persistent cough. After several days of taking the medicine, he developed severe stomach pains and neurological symptoms. He died within a week, probably from a combination of parasitic infection and toxic poisoning. Children were especially vulnerable to snail treatments because their smaller body size meant that even relatively small amounts of parasites or toxins could be fatal. Many children who were given snail medicine for childhood coughs developed serious complications that were worse than their original illness. The practice was particularly dangerous during winter months when fresh snails weren't available. Doctors would sometimes use preserved snails that had been stored for months in salt or wine. These preserved snails were often contaminated with additional bacteria and mold, making them even more dangerous than fresh ones. Some medieval doctors tried to improve snail treatments by adding other ingredients. They would mix the ground snails with herbs, spices, or other animal products, thinking this would make the medicine more effective. In reality, these additions often made the treatment even more dangerous by introducing additional sources of contamination. The belief in snail medicine was so strong that different regions developed their own specialized snail preparations. Some areas preferred land snails, while others used water snails. Some doctors insisted that snails collected during certain phases of the moon were more potent, leading to elaborate timing requirements for gathering the creatures. Despite the obvious dangers, snail treatments remained popular throughout the medieval period because they were relatively inexpensive and seemed logical based on medieval medical theory. It wasn't until much later that doctors realized that eating raw snails was one of the most reliable ways to get seriously sick. But if you think eating snails was the most extreme thing medieval doctors did to patient heads, you're in for a shock. Wait until you hear about the medical procedure that involved taking a drill to people's skulls while they were wide awake. Number 8. Trepanation, drilling holes in the skull. Now we come to perhaps the most horrifying medical procedure in medieval history. Trepanation, also known as trephining. This involved drilling holes directly into a patient's skull while they were still conscious, supposedly to cure headaches, mental illness, and various other conditions. Medieval doctors believed that many health problems were caused by evil spirits, bad humors, or excess pressure inside the head. They thought that by drilling a hole in the skull, they could release these harmful influences and allow the patient to heal naturally. Think of medieval trepanation like this. Imagine if modern doctors thought that all computer problems could be fixed by drilling holes in the computer case to let the bad electricity out. That's essentially the logic behind medieval skull drilling. They were trying to solve complex brain problems with a medieval equivalent of a power drill. Trepanation was most commonly used to treat severe headaches, seizures, mental illness, and head injuries. But some doctors also prescribed it for less serious conditions like depression, anxiety, and even tooth pain that seemed to be connected to head problems. But here's what made this procedure even more terrifying. Medieval doctors had elaborate theories about exactly where to drill the holes for different conditions. For headaches, they'd drill near the temples. For madness, they preferred the top of the skull. For seizures, they'd sometimes drill multiple holes in a specific pattern, believing this would create a better release system for the evil spirits. The surgical tools used for trepanation were primitive and terrifying. The main instrument was called a trepan, which was essentially a large drill with a circular saw blade at the end. There were also specialized chisels and scrapers for removing bone fragments and smoothing the edges of the hole. The procedure was performed without any anesthesia or pain relief. Patients were simply held down by several assistants while the doctor slowly drilled through their skull. The process could take hours, during which the patient would be conscious and experiencing unimaginable pain. First, the doctor would shave the patient's head and mark the spot where they planned to drill. Then they would use the trepan to slowly bore through the layers of the skull. The drilling had to be done very carefully because going too deep would damage the brain and kill the patient instantly. Once the hole was drilled, the doctor would use smaller tools to enlarge it and smooth the edges. The goal was to create a circular opening about 1 to 2 inches in diameter. Sometimes multiple holes would be drilled in different parts of the skull, depending on what condition was being treated. Here's an unexpected story that shows just how routine this procedure became. In 1347, there was a monastery in northern England where the monks developed what they called the divine headache cure. The monastery's infirmarian, Brother Thomas, had learned trepanation techniques and was performing the surgery on anyone who complained of headaches. Brother Thomas was convinced that headaches were caused by demons trying to escape from the skull, so he developed an elaborate system for determining exactly where to drill based on the patient's symptoms. He kept detailed records of each surgery, including diagrams showing where he had drilled and what results he achieved. Over the course of 3 years, Brother Thomas performed trepanation on more than 50 people, including fellow monks, local villagers, and even children. He was so confident in the procedure that he advertised it throughout the region, attracting patients from hundreds of miles away. But here's the horrifying reality. Of those 50 patients, only 3 survived more than a month after the surgery. Most died within days from infection or brain damage. But Brother Thomas interpreted even the deaths as successes, claiming that he had successfully released the demons from their skulls. The patients just happened to die from unrelated causes afterward. The 3 survivors all suffered permanent brain damage and were unable to care for themselves for the rest of their lives. But Brother Thomas claimed these were his greatest successes, saying that the surgery had calmed their minds by removing the demons that had been causing their headaches. The immediate results of trepanation were usually catastrophic. Most patients went into shock from the extreme pain and trauma of having their skull drilled open. Many died on the operating table from blood loss, shock, or accidental brain damage. Those who survived the initial procedure faced even greater dangers. The open hole in their skull provided a direct pathway for bacteria to reach their brain. In an era before antibiotics or sterile surgical techniques, brain infections were almost always fatal. Meningitis and brain abscesses were common complications of trepanation. These infections would cause fever, severe headaches, seizures, and death within days or weeks of the surgery. Some patients developed ongoing problems with brain function, including memory loss, personality changes, and permanent disabilities. There are horrifying accounts of trepanation procedures in medieval medical texts. One description tells of a patient who was held down by 6 men while a doctor drilled multiple holes in his skull to treat madness. The patient screamed throughout the procedure and died 3 days later from infection. But perhaps the most tragic aspect of trepanation was that it was sometimes performed on children. Parents desperate to cure their epileptic or mentally ill children would consent to having holes drilled in their skulls. These children rarely survived the procedure, and those who did were often left with permanent brain damage. Medieval doctors didn't understand the connection between the surgery and these complications. When patients died after trepanation, doctors would often blame the patient for waiting too long to get treatment, or claim that the evil spirits had been too strong to be released through a single hole. Some doctors even claimed that patients who died after trepanation had actually been cured of their original condition. They just happened to die from unrelated causes afterward. This twisted logic allowed them to continue performing the procedure despite its obviously terrible results. The surgical technique was passed down from doctor to doctor, with each practitioner adding their own modifications and improvements. Some claimed that holes drilled during certain phases of the moon were more effective. Others insisted that multiple small holes were better than single large ones. Despite the horrific mortality rate, trepanation remained a standard medical procedure throughout the medieval period. The combination of desperate patients, confident doctors, and complete lack of understanding about brain function meant that thousands of people underwent this deadly surgery. Archaeological evidence shows that trepanation was practiced all over medieval Europe. Skulls with drill holes have been found in graveyards from England to Russia, testament to just how widespread this dangerous practice was. Most of these skulls show no signs of healing, indicating that the patients died very soon after the surgery. But if drilling holes in people's skulls seems like the ultimate medical nightmare, wait until you hear about the plants medieval doctors used as medicine, plants so poisonous that a single leaf could kill you, but doctors prescribed them by the handful. Number 9. Herbal mixtures with poisonous plants. Medieval medicine relied heavily on plant-based treatments, which might sound relatively safe compared to some of the other horrors we've discussed. But medieval doctors regularly used some of the most poisonous plants known to humanity as standard medicines, often in doses that were guaranteed to kill their patients. Two of the most commonly used poisonous plants were henbane and mandrake. Both of these plants contain powerful alkaloids that are extremely toxic to humans, but medieval doctors believed they had special healing properties that made them worth the risk. But here's what made this particularly dangerous. Medieval doctors had no way to measure exact doses of these plant medicines. They didn't understand the concept of toxic levels, and they had no standardized measurements. One doctor's small dose might be another doctor's lethal overdose, and patients had no way of knowing which they were getting. Henbane was used primarily as a painkiller and sedative. Medieval doctors would prepare it by boiling the leaves and roots to create a concentrated extract. This extract was given to patients before surgery, during childbirth, or to treat severe pain from injuries or illness. The problem with henbane is that the difference between a therapeutic dose and a lethal dose is extremely small. The plant contains compounds called tropane alkaloids, which can cause hallucinations, seizures, coma, and death even in relatively small amounts. But medieval doctors didn't understand this. They thought that if a small amount of henbane helped with pain, then larger amounts would work even better. So they would keep increasing the dose until the patient either got better or died, never realizing that the treatment itself was often the cause of death. Patients who took henbane would often experience terrifying hallucinations and delirium. They would see things that weren't there, become extremely agitated, and sometimes become violent or try to harm themselves. Many patients never recovered from these episodes and remained in a permanent state of mental confusion. Mandrake was considered even more powerful than henbane. Medieval doctors believed it was the most potent healing plant in existence, capable of curing everything from infertility to demon possession. The root of the mandrake plant was thought to be especially powerful because it sometimes grows in a shape that resembles a human figure. Mandrake preparations were incredibly toxic. The plant contains the same alkaloids as henbane, but in much higher concentrations. Even tiny amounts could cause severe poisoning, and slightly larger doses were almost always fatal. Here's an unexpected story that shows just how dangerous these plant medicines could be. In 1203, there was a famous case involving Eleanor of Aquitaine, one of the most powerful women in medieval Europe. When Eleanor was in her 70s, she developed severe arthritis that made it difficult for her to walk or ride horses. Eleanor's personal physician, a man named Master Bernard, was considered one of the most skilled doctors in Europe. He decided to treat her arthritis with what he called the ultimate herbal cure, a combination of mandrake, henbane, and several other poisonous plants. Master Bernard was so confident in this treatment that he documented the entire process in detail, planning to write a medical treatise about his success in curing such a famous patient. He carefully prepared the herbal mixture according to what he believed were the most advanced techniques available. Eleanor took the herbal medicine for several weeks, and initially she seemed to improve. The pain in her joints decreased, and she was able to move around more easily. Master Bernard was convinced that his treatment was working perfectly. But what was actually happening was that the poisonous plants were slowly destroying Eleanor's nervous system. The temporary pain relief wasn't because her arthritis was being cured. It was because the plant toxins were damaging the nerves that carried pain signals to her brain. After about a month of treatment, Eleanor began experiencing severe side effects. She started having hallucinations, seeing people and animals that weren't there. She became confused and disoriented, sometimes not recognizing people she had known for decades. Master Bernard interpreted these symptoms as proof that the medicine was working. He believed that the hallucinations were evil spirits being driven out of her body by the powerful herbs. So instead of stopping the treatment, he actually increased the dose. Eleanor died within days of the increased dose, probably from acute poisoning caused by the massive amounts of plant toxins in her system. But Master Bernard claimed her death as a medical success, writing that he had successfully cured her arthritis and that she had died from unrelated old age. The preparation of mandrake was surrounded by elaborate rituals and superstitions. Doctors believed that the plant would scream when pulled from the ground, and that anyone who heard this scream would die instantly. So they developed complex procedures for harvesting mandrake that involved using dogs to pull the plants up while the human harvesters covered their ears. Once harvested, mandrake roots were dried, ground into powder, and mixed with wine or other liquids. Patients were given tiny amounts of this mixture, often just a few drops at a time. But even these small doses frequently caused severe poisoning. Other commonly used poisonous plants included belladonna, deadly nightshade, wolfsbane, and hemlock. Each of these plants was believed to have specific healing properties, but all of them were capable of killing patients even in small doses. Belladonna was used to treat eye problems because it causes the pupils to dilate. Medieval doctors thought this dilation was a sign of healing, not realizing it was actually a symptom of poisoning. Many patients who received belladonna treatments went blind or died from the toxic effects. Wolfsbane was used to treat heart problems and fever, but it contains compounds that can cause heart failure and death. Hemlock was prescribed for various conditions, but it's famous for being the poison that killed Socrates in ancient Greece. The most dangerous aspect of these herbal treatments was that medieval doctors often combined multiple poisonous plants in single preparations. They believed that mixing different herbs would make the medicine more powerful, but in reality, it just made the treatments more likely to kill the patient. There are documented cases of entire families dying from herbal treatments. One chronicle describes a household where everyone became sick with fever, so they were all given a mixture of henbane and mandrake. Instead of curing the fever, the herbal medicine poisoned the entire family. 7 people died within 3 days. Medieval doctors didn't understand the connection between these plant medicines and the deaths of their patients. When someone died after taking herbal treatments, doctors would often blame the patient for not taking enough medicine or claim that the patient's condition had been too advanced for even the most powerful herbs to cure. The belief in these poisonous plant medicines was so strong that it continued for centuries. Even as other medieval medical practices were being abandoned, doctors continued to prescribe deadly plant extracts to their patients and continued to kill them in large numbers. But if you think poisonous plants were the most shocking thing medieval people consumed as medicine, you haven't heard anything yet. Wait until you learn about the medieval belief that human blood was the ultimate cure-all and how they went about getting it. Number 10. Drinking blood as tonic. We've saved the most disturbing treatment for last. Medieval doctors actually prescribed drinking human blood as medicine. This wasn't some rare practice limited to a few crazy doctors. This was mainstream medical treatment that was widely accepted and even recommended by the church in some cases. The belief in blood as medicine was based on the medieval understanding of life force. Doctors believed that blood contained the essence of life itself, and that consuming the blood of healthy people could transfer their vitality and strength to sick patients. But not just any blood would work. Medieval doctors believed that the most powerful blood came from young, healthy people who had died violent deaths. The theory was that people who died suddenly retained more life force in their blood than people who died slowly from illness. This created a horrifying trade in human blood that was even more organized and disturbing than the bone powder industry. Executioners would collect blood from people who were beheaded or hanged, selling it to apothecaries who would process it into various medicines. The most valuable blood came from executed criminals who had been young and healthy when they committed their crimes. This blood was considered especially powerful because the criminals had supposedly retained their full life force right up until the moment of execution. But here's where this practice became truly horrific. Some doctors believed that the blood was most potent if it was consumed while it was still warm. This meant that people would actually gather at public executions, not just to watch the spectacle, but to collect fresh blood for medical purposes. There are documented cases of sick people drinking blood directly from execution victims while the bodies were still warm. One medieval chronicle describes wealthy patients paying executioners to let them drink blood straight from the neck wounds of beheaded criminals. Here's an unexpected story that shows just how far this practice went. In 1483, Pope Innocent VIII became seriously ill, and his doctors decided to try the most extreme blood treatment they could devise. The Pope's physicians didn't just want to give him blood from executed criminals, they wanted the freshest, most powerful blood possible. So they arranged to have 3 young, healthy boys brought to the Vatican specifically to provide their blood for the Pope's treatment. These weren't criminals or volunteers, they were just healthy children whose families had been paid to provide them for this medical procedure. The doctors planned to drain enough blood from each child to provide several treatments for the Pope, believing that the young, pure blood would restore his health and extend his life. The procedure was carried out in secret in the Pope's private chambers. The 3 boys were brought in one by one, and blood was drained from them into golden cups. The Pope was supposed to drink the blood while it was still warm to get maximum benefit from the life force. All 3 children died from blood loss during this procedure. But that wasn't the worst part. The Pope died anyway, just 3 days after receiving the blood treatments. The massive amounts of fresh human blood didn't cure his illness. It probably made him sicker by introducing infections and foreign proteins into his system. But the doctors claimed this as a partial success, saying that the blood treatments had extended the Pope's life by several days and had made his final illness more peaceful. They used this case to promote blood drinking as a proven treatment for serious illnesses. Blood treatments weren't limited to drinking fresh blood from executions. Medieval apothecaries developed various ways to preserve and prepare human blood for medical use. They would dry blood into powder that could be mixed with wine, or they would distill blood into concentrated essences that were supposed to be more potent than fresh blood. Some doctors prescribed blood baths, where patients would soak in tubs filled with warm human blood. Others recommended blood tonics that were taken daily, like vitamins. There were even blood-based cosmetics that were supposed to preserve youth and beauty. The most expensive blood preparations came from specific types of people. Virgin's blood was considered the most pure and powerful. Warrior's blood was preferred for treating cowardice or weakness. Scholar's blood was supposed to enhance intelligence and memory. But consuming human blood caused serious health problems. First, human blood from other people can carry diseases, parasites, and infections. In medieval times, when testing for diseases didn't exist, patients had no way of knowing whether the blood they were drinking was contaminated. Second, the human digestive system isn't designed to process large amounts of blood. Drinking significant quantities of blood causes severe stomach problems, including nausea, vomiting, and diarrhea. The high iron content in blood can also cause iron poisoning, leading to organ damage and death. Third, consuming blood from people who had died violent deaths often meant consuming blood that was already contaminated with bacteria and toxins from the decomposition process. Even fresh blood from executions could be dangerous if the person had been sick or malnourished. There are documented cases of people dying from blood treatments. One medieval text describes a wealthy merchant who paid a fortune for fresh blood from a young executed criminal. After drinking several cups of this blood over the course of a week, he developed severe stomach problems and died from what was probably a combination of infection and iron poisoning. Children were sometimes given blood treatments, usually in much smaller doses than adults. But even small amounts of contaminated blood could be fatal for children, whose immune systems couldn't fight off the infections and toxins. The practice was particularly dangerous during times of plague or epidemic disease. Blood from people who had died during outbreaks often carried the very diseases that patients were trying to cure. Instead of providing healing, these blood treatments often spread disease to healthy people. Medieval doctors didn't understand the connection between blood treatments and these complications. When patients became sicker after drinking blood, doctors would often blame the quality of the blood or claim that the patient hadn't consumed enough to get the full benefit. Some doctors developed increasingly elaborate blood preparations, thinking that more complex treatments would be more effective. They would combine blood from multiple people, mix it with various herbs and chemicals, or prepare it according to astrological charts. The belief in blood as medicine was so strong that it persisted well into the Renaissance period. Even educated people and wealthy families used blood treatments because they were considered the most advanced medicine available. But perhaps the most disturbing aspect of this practice was how it was justified morally and religiously. Some doctors claimed that drinking blood was a form of communion that brought patients closer to God. Others argued that since Christ had given his blood for humanity's salvation, using human blood for healing was following his example. This religious justification made blood treatment seem not just medically sound but spiritually beneficial, encouraging even more people to try these dangerous procedures. Here's the thing that really gets me about all these medieval medical treatments. Every single one of them was prescribed by educated people who genuinely thought they were helping their patients. These weren't sadistic torturers or ignorant villagers. These were the most learned individuals of their time, working with the best medical knowledge available to them. And that's what makes this so terrifying. If the smartest, most educated people of their era could be so completely wrong about something as fundamental as how to heal the human body, what does that say about our own certainty in the things we believe today? I mean, think about it. In 500 years, people might look back at some of our current medical practices with the same horror we feel when learning about medieval medicine. They might be shocked that we ever used chemotherapy, or performed certain surgeries, or prescribed certain drugs that we think are perfectly reasonable today. The medieval doctors weren't stupid or evil. They were just working with incomplete information and a worldview that was fundamentally flawed. They believed in the four humors theory because it was the best explanation they had for how the body worked. They trusted ancient texts because they didn't have better sources of information. They relied on religious explanations because they didn't understand the scientific method. But here's what really haunts me about this research. The patients trusted their doctors completely, just like we do today. When a medieval doctor told someone to drink boiled animal urine or eat ground-up human bones, the patient believed it would help them because the doctor was the expert. The doctor had years of training and access to medical texts that ordinary people couldn't read. That trust is simultaneously beautiful and terrifying. It shows how much faith people are willing to put in others when they're desperate for help. But it also shows how dangerous that trust can be when the experts are wrong. So there you have it, 10 medieval medical treatments that were worse than the diseases they were supposed to cure. From drinking boiled animal urine to having holes drilled in your skull while you're conscious, these treatments killed more people than they saved and caused unimaginable suffering for millions of patients. But here's what I want you to remember. The people who prescribed these treatments weren't monsters. They were doing their best with the knowledge they had, just like we are today. The real tragedy isn't that medieval medicine was so bad, it's that so many people suffered and died while doctors were trying to help them. Medieval medicine shows us what happens when you combine genuine caring with completely wrong information. It's a reminder that good intentions aren't enough if your understanding of the world is fundamentally flawed. The next time you visit a doctor and get a prescription that actually works, or have surgery that actually heals you instead of killing you, remember how lucky you are to live in an age where we understand things like germ theory, anesthesia, and sterilization. We've come an incredibly long way from the days when the cure was worse than the disease. But maybe most importantly, medieval medicine should make us humble about our own knowledge. We like to think we've figured everything out, but we're probably just as wrong about some things as those medieval doctors were. The difference is, we don't know which things yet. If this made you grateful for modern medicine, subscribe for more history that'll change how you see the world.